Is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Shortland.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I rise to support this condolence motion on the passing of Bob Hawke, larrikin leader legend, one of Australia's most loved sons, one of Labor's most revered figures, and one of Australia's greatest Prime Ministers. In fact, he was Labor's greatest and Australia's greatest peacetime Prime Minister. Bob Hawke's life spanned almost a century. He was born in December 1929 at the start of the Great Depression, an economic catastrophe which inflicted immense hardship on the people of Australia. He died 9 decades later as Australia was enjoying the longest period of uninterrupted growth of any advanced economy, thanks to the reforms he introduced as Prime Minister. Over the span of Bob's life, the country experienced extraordinary events, wars and military conflicts, political crises, economic booms and busts, and went through tremendous social, technological, cultural and political changes. From his early days as a trade union advocate to his time as Prime Minister and his later years as a Labor stalwart and elder statesman, Bob Hawke was at the centre of so many of these events and was responsible for so many of their changes. The catalogue of his reforms, the list of his achievements, is long and it is far-reaching, modernising and internationalising the Australian economy, unlocking its potential and underwriting 3 decades of prosperity, reorienting the nation from its past as a far-flung part of the British Empire to its future as a confident, outward-looking nation playing a leading role in the Asia-Pacific region, building the Australian social safety net, from Medicare to occupational superannuation, from fair wages and working conditions to accessible higher education, and creating a tolerant, open and diverse society through equal rights for women, support for a multicultural community, human rights and anti-discrimination legislation, and starting the process of reconciliation with Indigenous Australians. Other speakers in his House have reflected on these reforms in more detail. I do want to reflect on the fact that many people have been claiming the legacy of Bob Hawke, but most of these reforms were not bipartisan, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm sad to say. Many of them were hard-fought and were only secured through great political skill and courage and cemented through winning 4 elections. I'd now like to focus briefly on an aspect of the Hawke legacy which is sometimes overlooked, and that's his role in building an independent Australian defence and strategic posture. Under Bob Hawke's Prime Ministership, the then Defence Minister Kim Beazley conducted a far-reaching review of Australia's defence structure and capabilities. This led to the Hawke government's seminal 1987 White Paper entitled The Defence of Australia. The White Paper laid out a fundamental strategic objective of defence self-reliance within the framework of the ANZUS Alliance and Australia's regional associations. It also developed the strategic concept of defence in depth, and as Alan Gingell has written, made the case for a more regionally engaged Australian focus on Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. The Hawke government also commissioned a Cooksey review of defence industry, which resulted in reforms to improve Australian industry capabilities and alignment with strategic defence planning. This was seminal work that represented a break with the past in terms of Australia's defence planning, and another great legacy of the Hawke government. Another one I'd like to mention briefly is his recognition of building political support for economic reforms. Bob understood that to make difficult reforms like dismantling protectionism, restructuring industries and opening up the economy, he had to bring the workforce along with the government. Intrinsic to his approach to national leadership was his empathy with working people. This allowed him to articulate and explain the economic reforms and to work in partnership with the unions, the workforce and the wider community and in implementing and delivering this reform. This was so vital, Mr Deputy Speaker. To be fair and to be without any disrespect, it didn't matter what the opposition of the day stance was on tariff reforms, on industry restructuring. What mattered was the attitude of the workforce, because ultimately they are the ones that bore the pain of this very necessary structural adjustment. And the legacy and the signature approach of Bob Hawke in building consensus, taking the workforce and unions along on this very important restructuring, was essential to carrying forward these reforms. Bob Hawke's presence in modern Australia went beyond the many important achievements and historic reforms. For in his gregarious personality, his reverent wit, his sharp intelligence and his passionate and generous spirit, he embodied and personified the Australian character. I want to finish my remarks by acknowledging that Bob has been a huge inspiration in my own political development, like almost every member on this side of the parliament. I was lucky enough to first meet Bob in 1986 when he came to open the Mooney Mooney Bridge on the Pacific Highway on the New South Wales Central Coast. Anyone who drives the Pacific Motorway knows the Big Dipper, the Mooney Mooney Bridge, and Bob Hawke opened it in 1986. My parents were staunch Labor supporters and took me to the event. I was 7 years old, standing on that bridge, and I was thrilled to get the Prime Minister's autograph. Now he has passed, and Mr Deputy Speaker, I wish to extend my condolences on behalf of the people of Shortland to Blanche, Susan, Stephen, Rosalind, Lewis, to the rest of Bob's family and friends, and to acknowledge the role of the late Hazel Hawke. The nation has lost a leader, a reformer, a statesman and a great citizen. They have lost a husband, a father, a grandfather and a loved one. We thank them for the support they gave, which allowed Bob to make such a contribution to the public life of this nation.